and welcome to Minor Compositions. Today we're joined by Pil and Galia Kollectiv. Thanks for coming along.
Thanks for having us.
And today's episode is based on back in the autumn, Pil and Galia had invited me to come to London to take part in their book release for their book Subversive Performance in the Age of Human Capital. And for various reasons not worth going into, I wasn't able to go. So I thought, oh, well, I've already read the book. It's a great book. Let's just make this into a conversation that we record and have online instead. Maybe not as fun as an in-person interaction, but it's better than nothing. And I really enjoyed reading this. It felt like how would you say? It felt like, you ever have a time when like you meet an old friend you haven't seen in about a decade, and like you haven't seen each other, but the conversation picks up right where you were before.
Thanks.
Yeah.
That's very flattering.
Yeah. So you cover a lot of stuff that's quite interesting in terms of the place of art performance today, what it means to be subversive, a lot of things. So we'll get into a lot of stuff. But maybe I want to start as a sort of easier way to get into the book is sort of where did it come from? How did you write this? How do we come to be reading this text today? And we'll start from there. Is that cool?
Sure. So the book came out of our PhD. We were doing this research alongside a kind of practice-based project. But it was also a means of staying in the UK. I like to kind of put that out there. We needed to do a PhD to stay.
It was your green card.
It was our green card. And I think it's important to talk about circumstances as much as kind of content. And we'll talk more about the circumstances as we go along, I'm sure. But yeah, it came out of that doctoral research at Goldsmiths. And as we were developing a kind of film and performance practice, we were thinking very kind of self-consciously and reflexively about the conditions under which we were working, which included the need to stay in the UK, but also working collaboratively with other people and finding it very difficult to fund that, increasingly difficult as the circumstances around us were kind of changing. As we were writing the PhD, the conservative liberal Democrat coalition was coming into power. It felt like a kind of end of an era after the financial crisis. So we had been attracted to London as MA students by a kind of vibrant art and culture scene that was promoted internationally very kind of consciously by the Labour government as part of this kind of cool Britannia idea. We had visited London a few times and been to some, YBA exhibitions. We didn't really know that much about art, but we were very into music, and this seemed like the place to be. So we were drawn by all these things, and they were kind of disappearing. And the circumstances that had made it possible for the artists that we studied under and that we researched on our MA to make art, those circumstances were disappearing. We kept being told about like artist-run spaces in East London and all this kind of stuff. People living in squats on the dole, getting lots of arts funding, and none of that seemed available to us. What we were doing practically at the time was increasingly teaching to fund our life in London and our studies. So as well as undertaking a PhD, we started working as lecturers in art, and we still do. And we became very aware of these different kinds of work that we were doing and kind of thinking about them in relation to one another. So what kind of work is it to be an artist? What kind of work is it to work for university? How are these things different? How are these things different to other kinds of work that we could be doing? Part of the idea of moving to London to become artists was to not get a kind of boring office job. And yet we found ourselves doing a kind of office job of sorts where you were lucky to have an office if you got an office. And also working with people and directing them to perform made us think about how all of these were different kinds of performances, the performance of being an artist, the performance of teaching, and the kind of performances that we were calling performance. So we
Mm.
started to think about all those things together, and I think the book sort of came out of those circumstances and research.
And in hindsight, I mean, this is something that we can only see now, I think, like a decade after we conducted a lot of the research for the book, is that the book was really a kind of reaction to, yeah, as Galia said, the conditions of austerity that replaced what was before. And we were finding the kind of strategies and the kind of problems that people grappled with in art before the kind of financial collapse, before austerity. We found them kind of like simply not convincing enough, not good enough, not kind of like addressing the urgent material conditions. So a lot of people were really worried back then with the problem of that art is simply a form of kind of luxury consumption. It's an activity that is not inherently different from a luxury brand like, you know, fashion or something like that. It operates on the same tools, and therefore it can only offer the same critical horizon as, say, kind of a neoliberal product, as in like kind of the liberation of the self, or all sorts of kind of like freedom that are kind of part of the game. So a lot of people seemed quite bothered with that kind of like similarity between art and other forms of visual cultural production outside of art, and the disappearance of a particular model of authority or autonomy or authorship in art. That was the kind of like dominant question when we kind of started dealing with these things in London in many ways, in the kind of like late 90s, early 90s. And those questions evaporated really quickly because it became very obvious that artists would have to redefine what they do, and that the cultural industry is reconfiguring itself as in relation to new material economic conditions. So the book is really our attempt to think through that moment of transition.
Like another really simple way of putting that, just to kind of add to that point, is I think a lot of 90s culture was about the, not just art, the kind of collapse of the idea of an alternative culture and like everything is now mainstream. And then how do we do something critical when we're surrounded by such seductive commodities, and art or any kind of cultural production becomes just another seductive commodity. So there was a lot of discussion of the kind of seduction of the commodity. And increasingly, we started looking around us and saying, whenever we saw an artwork that suggested that this was a kind of example of 90s problems, which is the same thing as, you know, the idea of this kind of boomer problem, where, you know, most of us should be so lucky as to be seduced by a commodity. Mostly you spend money on stuff you don't even want, like, you know, the access to the means of production, like a phone. You know, it's not even seductive anymore. So we were trying to think about how that represented a kind of shift that required a different mode of critique.
And the way that people dealt with these 19 problems was a lot of the times through a kind of ironic mode. This is why irony became like the focus of a lot of our research here. So we're really trying to break down what irony means, what good forms of irony exist, if at all, and how we can differentiate between kind of like, you know, those ironic moves that we saw as impotent and other things that maybe by mistake are grouped together as irony, but actually propose something better.
I think there's something quite nice about starting with a little bit with the context were operating from. Because it's interesting that when we look at visual culture, when we look at art, when we read literature, where we start by thinking about context. I mean, you can hear Jameson saying always historicize, right? But there's this funny thing when we read critical theory. we've almost deliberately ignored the context, which is quite strange because in certain ways, if you're doing critical theory, the thing you want to respond to most is the context you're in, because usually it's crap, and you're trying to find out how to get out of crap. And so what you're talking here is about this situation going, all these things which drew you to a place that made it to be an exciting place, all those conditions are changing, and you don't know how to operate within or how best or to really engage with that context. And I think a lot of the problems that you're wrestling with are problems that I've sort of been trying to figure out my own work. And I'm not saying I've gotten any get closer, but it's sort of like I think those are quite some of the problems. And this is maybe to start with one of them. I quite like we were talking about sort of the usual associations made between art and democracy, right? And how art should be engaged, could be part of a democratizing process. So think of here things like the rise of the Biennale circuit, and how that will create a sort of like European cooperation with around these large art fairs and stuff like that, right? Stuff that's been going on for a long time. But one of the things you point out here is that if we're now in an age of human capital or of immaterial labor or of a certain kind of performance as labor, that kind of disrupts art's ability to operate in the same democratic fashion because it shifts more towards, I guess, what Virno coming out of Hannah Arendt would say more towards labor and less away from politics. Or
Mhm.
sorry, I always get that distinction wrong. Sorry.
Yeah. No, like economics for Arendt is the kind of like in the domestic sphere, it's private. It's meant to be removed, like labor is removed from politics, and politics is the expression of kind of free will that is not engaged in kind of labor waged activities.
So again, to start to answer that, far less theoretically and a lot more contextually. As I was saying, we were much more embedded in the world of music than in the world of art when we came to Goldsmiths. We'd been music journalists for a while, and we always had an interest in that kind of context. And that seemed to us like a much more democratic context from the perspective of the consumer. So, you can buy a record, it's not that expensive, whereas you go to an art gallery and it's all not really for you. It's like way too expensive. So at a very simple level, we had this kind of idea that we wanted art to be more democratic in that way, like that anyone can buy it, anyone can make it. Growing up with an interest in punk and DIY music, that was our ambition for art. And when we got to Goldsmiths, we kind of took that for granted, that assumption that everybody wanted that. But we were kind of interrogated by our supervisors as to, who actually wants art to be more democratic and what even is democracy. So we ended up going into this research into the very idea of democracy. And what we quickly realized was that while there was this kind of strand of art, in the context of modernism at least, that wanted art to be democratized, that everyone will become an artist. It's a kind of avant-garde idea. That idea was as full of contradictions as was the kind of very definition of democracy. And we realized that those tensions could be teased out in a way that might help us out of that kind of impasse that we felt around this idea of critique. So we started to think about democracy as a kind of dual idea of, on the one hand, freedom, and on the other hand, equality. And those things being kind of often at odds with each other, and different theorists of democracy emphasizing the one over the other. Certain of the democratic aspirations that we identified for art, like this idea that everyone should be able to do it and buy it and all that, have been realized, albeit, as we were saying, kind of ironically within this neoliberal model of human capital. So if everyone becomes a kind of entrepreneur of the self, and our work increasingly demands of us a kind of creativity and self-expression, then we have the ideal of everyone becoming an artist. But that freedom certainly, such as it is, it's kind of false idea of freedom anyway, has not come with any kind of sense of equality. And that already is a kind of problem within that. But it's also a very kind of formal freedom, because ultimately you're beholden to the market, and you can't totally achieve emancipation within that. You have no real autonomy. So we were kind of thinking, what scope is there for still making these demands upon the system whereby everyone is kind of on paper an artist or a creative agent, but in reality, we have a kind of reduction in real meaningful democracy.
That's kind of interesting. If you go back to, you mentioned you're coming out of a sort of a music DIY punk scene. If you're
Yeah.
talking about the rise of DIY punk in let's say, conditions of Fordism, where we have jobs are long term, organizations are stable and hierarchical, and you say, oh, no, no, we're going to do a small network thing. We'll be using minimal resources and just using small communities. And it's like, that's cool, but now that's what everyone does, and that's what you have to do, and it's not an alternative to the power structure. It literally is the power structure.
Precisely. But I think that just means we need to be a bit more attuned to these kind of distinctions within that. So I think that's where it becomes helpful to unpick big concepts like, this is more democratic, this is more, DIY or whatever. What does that actually mean? So, for example, there's this idea that entrepreneurial activity equates to ownership of the means of production, but actually you don't own the means of production whatsoever. If you're, for example, using online platforms to disseminate your product, which is something creative that you do, then the people owning the means of production are those people who own those platforms. And, you're just an employee with no rights. So I think understanding at what points these kind of markers of uniqueness and difference are kind of celebrated, but also at what points the kind of unifying universal equivalent of capital kind of reasserts itself at a higher level, where the kind of reification happens that converts all of that into something that can be exploitative and allow capitalism to continue. That's kind of really crucial to not becoming one of those ex-punks who is now like a Brexiteer, because that's what happens otherwise. Like people who used to be super into DIY culture end up, now being freedom of speech warriors on the right, because they kind of get the critique wrong, I think.
Well, it's interesting you said that, because okay, you're operating from an art world context and an art school context, but coming from a business school context, I found many of the similar things. What I mean here, for instance, is for a while I was confused of why somebody of my students would say, "Oh, what do you want to do? I really want to start my own business." But then when I realized what they were actually saying is they wanted to have more control over their own conditions of life and the ability to exercise some autonomy over their schedule and be able to actually determine what they're doing with themselves. And I go, oh, I understand that. And a drive to, want to pursue business or whatever because it gives you a better condition of life is obviously very understandable. And it gives you a different sort of point of commonality where, where you realize, okay, this is what you're after, and this is, how you pursue it. It's almost like you're coming at the same problem from a different angle.
It's very, very important to keep updating your kind of like terms and to kind of address new material complexities and realities. I think in the book, one of the kind of like formulations of democracy that we thought was kind of interesting and worth thinking about is Badiou's, where it's kind of like, and in one of his short essays, he kind of like considers democracy to be a sort of vehicle that translates. It's sort of like an empty place that sort of communicates the idea of equality. Equality is something that is more stable, kind of like philosophically. It's not something that is kind of like contingent on those kind of material conditions as much. But democracy is, and democracy breaks down equality to sort of existing social structures. So, with democracy is a moving kind of target. It keeps changing, and it's not like that. There's always like one kind of like democracy that we need to pursue. In the 19th century, in the cultural realm, democratic cultural institutions were aligned to the state and to kind of national identity. It's the museums were opened after the French Revolution in order to provide the masses with an identity signifier. Or Walter Benjamin analyzes the kind of great expo exhibitions as, essentially the emergence of a spectacle cultural industry that organizes mass viewership as a kind of form of kind of like providing people a sense of belonging together, which is actually quite empty and organized around technological advancements and national signifiers. So that democracy has been replaced with the current model of democracy, I think, that is on offer is very often a kind of equality of appearance or equality of representation, which is again kind of like a market democracy, that different images of forms of life should appear in this market of lives. And this is a kind of good ideal to aspire to. And again, we find it quite unsatisfactory in the book. And so we're kind of working a bit hard there to sort of think about what a more interesting and still kind of valid project of democracy could be for us.
I keep thinking about these ads that I see everywhere these days of bio trackers, like these things that tell you what to eat based on your body.
So like apps that,
So all these things, they kind of celebrate difference. It's like you're unique. You need to have a unique diet. You can no longer eat with your family or your, any kind of collective formation because you are a unique organism. But interestingly, and I'm not dismissing people with like specific, health issues that exists, of course, but there's this kind of optimization of the unique biome, but everything has to translate ultimately into everyone buys the app. So there's this kind of interesting duality between difference and sameness at work in that. And I think we were trying to think about that kind of relationship between difference and sameness and think about, okay, where do these differences come from that justify, differential positions within the market? And I think the more you dig down into that, the more you see it's just a kind of reification of historical injustice, and there is no justification for it. So I think those very non-artistic thoughts, like those are thoughts that, as you say, align with what you do in the business school and, with politics. And we were thinking about very broad philosophical questions, but they kind of converted back into art for us around the question of exceptionalism. So should art be somehow exceptional, somehow exempt from all these other considerations? So if we live within a kind of market economy, should art somehow have a special status within that? Or is the artist a special person who has a special perspective, unlike everyone else, and can therefore stand outside of society and criticize it? And the more we realized that these differences were kind of fake differences, the more we became skeptical of that idea of the artist as exceptional. So we were trying to see what was there within these avant-garde demands on art to perform some kind of revolutionary function that we could salvage, that didn't collapse back into this idea of exceptionalism, which we thought was completely commensurate with, as you say, the way things are.
Well, there's something quite interesting. I mean, this is one of the broader points to make about the kind of critique one can develop based upon where you're going from. So for instance, let's say traditional notions of critique tend to rely upon the idea about art not being labor, art being exceptional. And if the point is actually that artistic production and creativity have now been fully, or let's hedge the bets here, but fully assumed or mostly subsumed in capitalism, you can't fall back on this idea of critique as being external because there is no external position to critique from. And thus you'd end up having to have a different notion of how you're going to do critique because you're already in it.
Exactly. And there's no way of stepping outside it. You know, we are subject to exactly the same conditions as every other worker. It's not like we have some special kind of access to some other plane. So for us, this means we need to recognize ourselves as workers. And that means functioning in solidarity with other workers and understanding that the things that make it difficult for us to organize as artists are also the things that make it hard for workers to organize within a post-Fordist economy. So since starting my job at Chelsea, I've become the chair of the local union branch. And I am very interested in how difficult it is for a union to operate, even within a structure as, you know, traditional as a university. Like in a way, I'm lucky. I'm a waged laborer. I have a salary, and you know, I'm within an institution. Unlike many of my more precarious colleagues and friends, but even within that, it's hard to find a day for us to meet in a space because increasingly people work different random shifts in different places. And I think that's very symptomatic and not special. And I think that's the same as how artists find it difficult, you know, when it comes to stuff like going on strike. You know, it used to be this kind of question, a few artists played around with the idea of an artistic strike, but how do you withdraw your labor as an artist? What does that mean? Who cares if you don't show up to the studio? But increasingly, it's actually kind of similar within many fields of intellectual labor. Like, do I not have an idea? Am I then not doing my research day? Or like, you know, if I don't come in and it's not my day to come in anyway because I'm part-time or hourly paid, like, so all of these questions become actually uniting rather than ways of setting ourselves apart. And once we understand that, I think we need to approach resistance in a different way.
I quite like the way that you draw on the work of Paulo Virno, perhaps because I'm also using his ideas a lot. But there's this idea that once labor becomes virtuosic, becomes something that doesn't have an end object, but rather is, well, the performance, right? It creates a different, almost like psychological relationship to the work you're doing, where that almost makes it like more difficult to down tools, because if the tools are your own subjectivity, your experiences, your creativity, how you put down imagination, care, intelligence, like, you know, responsiveness is a lot more complex than, for instance, how you stop a factory line or how you exit a mine, right? It's when subjectivity is very much embedded in labor, it becomes a lot harder to sort of like separate it from.
Yeah, absolutely. That's, you know, and obviously it kind of opens up a lot of really interesting and complex questions, like about labor in general, like, you know, sort of like unproductive labor, sort of like care, or sort of like domestic labor, that is also simply a kind of product of the self, of being, you know, nice and supportive and comforting and just being there to kind of like for someone else. Those types of actions are also, in a way, a form of labor that is of the self, and we're always there as part of kind of like the kind of cycle of labor, productive and reproductive, and but with sort of like with the virtuosic performance. So Virno highlights this kind of like in you know, in very well known text. Virno highlights the fact that Marx talks about those two forms of performance, the ballerina and the pianist, as kind of like edge cases. They're like almost off the scale of what he's willing to consider sort of like legitimate labor. They're really they're an anomaly. They're not part of.
Doesn't he call them servile labor, I believe?
I can't remember now.
Sorry, yeah.
But
Yeah.
I think the key concept is like if our kind of paradigm is everyone works in a factory and they make stuff, and then there's the capitalist who owns the machines and the employer and then the employees. The ballerina would be a kind of exception to that because she doesn't make anything. She owns her body, so she's not employed in the same way. But that's a kind of anomaly, whereas we would argue alongside Virno that now, and many of the kind of post-autonomous theories, now that would be the paradigmatic case, at least in the global north, increasingly I would say globally. Most people I know don't work in factories. It doesn't mean factory work doesn't still get done, but when we're thinking about this particular context in which we are operating, that's not the paradigm. Most people will do work that is a kind of performance, and it doesn't have to be virtuosic in the sense of like being very good or exceptional. We've often used the example of working in telemarketing. So even if your job is just to answer the phone and do a performance of saying have a nice day, that's still a kind of performance rather than a making of stuff. And historically, I think this we can say the same about art. If art was conceived of as mainly the making of stuff, sure, artists still make paintings and sculptures, and the art market is still comprised of, I don't know, 97% paintings probably. But a lot of the work that the artist does now, even the kind of very traditional painter, would involve the artist talk, the statement, the kind of performance of being an artist within a discursive field or in a discursive plane, which means that increasingly we are these kind of virtuosic, immaterial laborers because of the way art functions in its kind of post-conceptual phase. So that means if our work is a kind of performance of the self, it becomes much harder to differentiate the kind of point of conversion of that into something that is valorized, that is turned into profit for a capitalist, from the just general being of a human. I don't think that means that conversion doesn't happen. So aside from our art and lecturing, we have this research group, and we're currently reading a text by Beverly Best called a book called The Automatic Fetish. That's our current reading in our reading group. And we've been discussing her distinction between, she says, reproductive labor, being a mother or a carer, all those things. Sure, they're like a free gift to the capitalist, but they're not in and of themselves forms of labor because they're not valorized. They're not kind of converted into a commodity. They don't function or wage. They don't function in the same way structurally. I think within post-Fordist labor, it's sometimes difficult to see the difference between the waged bit and the bit that is unwaged. Sometimes it can be the same action in different circumstances or at different times. I don't think that invalidates Best's argument whatsoever. But I think that
maybe to kind of like put it in a slightly different way, Peter Osborne writes that kind of post-conceptual art still needs to retain a kind of necessary material element. There has to be something, a letter, sort of like image, an object, something that sort of around that the concept is sort of like woven. And in a similar way, there still is a kind of material or experiential commodity or kind of like object at the heart of post-Fordist labor. But around it, there are, so, as an example, like, we have about 50 barbershops on our street. And I know that, like, the one that I used to go to a few years ago spends all his time pretty much on social media, on Instagram, constantly marketing his kind of like skills as a barber, or kind of like he's expanding his social network, trying to seduce people to come to him and not the other 50, etc. And I believe he probably spends more time doing that than actually giving haircuts. But
So he's actually a haircut influencer.
yeah, but it's a must. It's a necessity. If he doesn't do that, he will not make enough money, probably, from simply sitting there in the barber shop and waiting for customers. Just not going to happen. So work today is defined by, yeah, you still provide a sort of like legitimate old-fashioned product like haircut, but it's structured in such a way that your kind of like performance of the self, of your taste, of your personality, of your opinions, of your friendship circles is more important than the actual kind of cutting of hair.
But that's why we need this analysis, because what I was going to say is I think Beverly Best is right that those distinctions are still operative, but because they're so diffuse in our personal experience of them, it can become quite difficult to struggle against exploitation. So when your self-perception is that you are self-exploiting, rather than understanding the ways in which you're enmeshed within these kind of chains of valorization, then you at best can feel guilty for spending too much time on social media or not doing something. It's very difficult to see yourself as part of a structure that you might do something about.
So two thoughts on that. One, in certain ways, I think, and this was a big debate in socialist feminist literature in the 70s, whether or not social reproductive labor is directly productive capital or not, to me seems almost kind of like beside the point, because it could be directly productive of value for capital, or it might just underpin it. In either case, the question is, what capacity does it have to block or interrupt or to struggle over it, more so than whether it's, I suppose this is a very sort of like nice sort of like Marxist angels on a pin question, right? But it's more of like, what can you do about it rather than, and one of the things, I'm back to Virno for a second. One of the reasons why I've been drawn to Virno more recently, as opposed to reading other post-autonomous like Hart and Negri, is Hart and Negri have this version of immaterial labor where it almost instantly becomes a kind of social cooperation. It leads to all of these great political outcomes, and any second now, the multitude's totally gonna get to it. And Virno, on the other hand, is more like, actually, it's a bit more complicated than that. We have this sort of like what he calls what's it, versus public, this without a public sphere, where you get this these almost these crisscrossing forms of immaterial labor, which rather than leading to cooperation and a better politics, lead to much worse. Lead to blockages, lead to reactionary currents. And to me, it seems that actually Virno's analysis there of that darker analysis seems to be more accurate, at least the way the world has gone in the past 15 years.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think the one thing, not that I would be nostalgic for factory work, nor have I any experience of it really, but at least on paper, it kind of leaves your mind free. I think there's something about the way in which this kind of immaterial labor requires a full engagement of your not just thoughts, but also affective horizons, means that it's very difficult to disengage from it enough to do something to resist it.
Hmm. No, I could definitely understand that. I mean, when I was younger, I worked as a dishwasher and as a petrol station attendant, and I can tell you, I guarantee you, when I finished dishwashing, I did not sit around and think about like critiques of dishwashing or like, there's something nice about being able to leave the workspace and not have to worry about it.
Precisely.
Yeah.
But if we get back to sort of this idea about certain forms of laboring, which tend to block political action, tend to preempt it. The way that I thought about it is when you meet with artists and talk about their practice, they're so busy talking about their practice, they find it hard to talk about the conditions they're working in or how you might struggle over those conditions. Like, what do you do with that? What do you do with the blockage, or other than go, here's a blockage?
Well, so one thing we have recently become obsessed with is the library in Helsinki. So we went on a trip to Helsinki for no real reason other than I'd always wanted to go to Finland, and we went. We saw the Moomin Museum, but we saw the library, and the library has spaces that you can book to do stuff on your library card, like meeting rooms. There's also guitars that you can book out. And as a guitarist, I was very excited about that. There's chessboards. You can get a ball to play outside if you fancy that. So it's not just about getting books. They had like 3D printers you can book. There's sewing machines. There's all kinds of stuff like infrastructure. And you can just get that on your library card. And it struck me that that was a really interesting model for providing the means of artistic production to everyone. So, when I talk to artists, often they're very, when they will talk about their conditions of making, they're very interested in getting more funding, and kind of special pleading, like, yes, we live in this kind of market economy, it's awful. We should demand more funding for the arts, or, better access to the arts for people from disadvantaged backgrounds, or, all these ways of like carving out a space for artists within this horror, instead of actually thinking, no, everyone should have access to these things. You shouldn't have to prove that you're an artist. You shouldn't have to, compete with other artists for this space. You should just, if you want a guitar, go book it at the library. Everyone can do that. So I don't know that that's like a perfect model for anything, but I think what we do, other than say, here is a block, is say, why just for artists? Like, why shouldn't everyone have enough free time to just do stuff? And whether we call it art or not matters less.
No, I really I like that as an idea and as a model, because rather than saying, "Hey, artists, let band together and buy a building yourselves," it's almost like, what are the conditions of creating collective infrastructure such that rather than it being about your little group or this group or that group, actually it enables wider access in a, dare I say it, democratizing fashion.
Well, it's about the recognition of, okay, for all creatives now, what does that mean in terms of redistribution of, access to means of production? Like, it shouldn't just be about redefining artists as the kind of special creatives. Like, maybe there's an opportunity there. So this is where maybe I'm an optimist about post-Fordism, where I think actually this allows us to fight for something even better than we would have fought for under the previous kind of model of what art was in relation to labor.
Yeah, I mean, maybe this brings us a little bit closer to the concept of overidentification that we develop in the book. But in a way, there was a moment in the early 80s when sort of like the Thatcherist government offered a lot of support, financial support for people who were willing to establish a business, essentially to become self-employed, to turn themselves into a business. This was a new thing, and the government was quite ideological about it. They wanted people to be kind of like, their own bosses. And a lot of artists sort of took the grants and obviously didn't become like, I don't know, like plumbers or caterers or whatever, kind of people with vans. But simply invested the money. It was quite easy to argue that you're investing money in something legitimate, as in running an artist-run space or kind of a nightclub or a music venue or something. It's very hard to kind of like say what is profit-making legitimate business and what's not. And maybe from day one, the idea of like art education in the UK at least was was kind of linked to sort of like industry and industrial production. The kind of like government always wanted to train people to produce kind of like to become designers or kind of like industrial designers and to be absorbed into those industries. So this is why they supported art schools. And again, but out of that, we got more than kind of like, kind of the Dysons of the world or whatever. So I'm kind of thinking very strategically maybe at the moment in terms of kind of like, because your question from before was how to organize essentially. How do we organize out of these current conditions? Maybe what we need to do is to identify what is on offer currently by the government or by the kind of like current ideological configuration, and to try and work together to say, yeah, that's what we want. We want like sewing machines for everyone. If the government says everyone should be a creative, great, give us like the tools. We'll do it.
I always thought when David Cameron was talking about the big society that we should show him how big a communist society could be.
Well, the argument you're kind of making, and the way I'm hearing it, is almost like if the problem is that the forms of laboring we're involved in present blockages and challenges to forms of artistic practice, the way that you solve that isn't an intellectual analysis of it, but it's actually more at the level of how you practically organize alternative structurings of desires and working such that you almost then lean into I guess, forms of immanent critique through the organizing practice itself.
Well, I think that maybe comes from being artists and this research coming out of that. It's like I say, it was a practice-based PhD. So we've never just done kind of theory for the sake of doing theory. For me, there's much more at stake in using theory to better understand the conditions of my own life and the life of my peers and how we improve that. So it's a very practical thing. And I've always thought of writing as also a kind of practice that has its own conditions. So for us, these things have always been very enmeshed, I would say.
One of the images I like, particularly from the book, in a bit because it's a bit silly, is the idea that art as an everyday tool is like can be like a Dadaist toothbrush.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, we definitely have always had an interest in the art of the early 20th century, and that's, yeah, something we've mined quite consistently in our practice, that interest in modernism. I think partly it is that kind of utopian idea. We were very much trying to get away from a certain postmodern and we kind of, defeatism around the possibility of any kind of change. But at the same time, we didn't want to just be nostalgic about the 20th century. I sometimes feel sort of sad that I wasn't born in a different time because you read art books and, look at the culture of the past and it seems very appealing in retrospect. But then I think, well, had I lived in those times, probably none of that would have been accessible to me as a woman, as a Jew, all of that, like, probably would never have been for me. So that's fine. I don't think we need to go back to Dada or to kind of modernism to find a way forward. But I think what is useful, maybe because we studied history at one point, but for me, what is interesting in going back to those things is thinking about the roads not taken. So within those kind of ideas, like Dada, you could find a lot of things, that haven't become the main museum display. Like, if you look at the things that have been canonized, there are always things that have kind of fallen by the wayside that could have led us in a different direction. And I think that was what that project was about, like the revisiting of modernism. We were very inspired by the Slovenian group NSK and Irwin, which we write about extensively in the book. And they have this idea that we should approach the avant-garde. Yeah,
Oh,
I
you have
see.
a teddy.
You have the
Amazing.
NSK teddy bear.
Yeah.
Very good. But yeah, we were very inspired by their idea of retrograde, or, you know, kind of looking back to the 20th century as a kind of traumatic rupture full of unrealized potential, as much as looking at it as a kind of
It's
complete
kind of like
historical project.
historical dialectics, those moments of rupture, like, you know, sort of Dada, and sort of like kind of like post-Soviet art certainly was. They offered kind of like, you know, fascinating and largely unrealized models for kind of artistic production, but and obviously the kind of like counter movement closed it down significantly, partly by absorbing those kind of potentialities into market kind of like conditions, and kind of like into sort of like kind of like lifestyle options. So I guess the idea is to kind of go back to those moments before the kind of like before they were tamed, before the potential was tamed, and to sort of see if we can still take something from that moment.
One of the things I really like in the historical bits about, or sort of how you talk about the relationship between Dadaism and constructivism. So let's say that Dada is the moment of like mocking laughter and absurdity, and then constructivism is more like how do we embed creativity in transforming everyday life in different ways. And in some ways, what's the book? Is it Boris Groy's book on Stalinism, where he argues that Stalinism is sort of an ironic like realization of constructivism? It seems almost what you're doing is kind of a similar project where you're looking at sort of what are the sort of like traumatic remnants of previous moments of trying to bring art into everyday life. We've got that, but in the worst way possible. And it's a kind of, it is an NSK kind of move, trying to say, okay, how do we sort of go back and sort of retap these moments, rework them, try to figure out, what else is left of them, rather than sort of, they don't have to play out that way. They can play out something otherwise.
I mean, as much as Groys and NSK and that kind of East European perspective on it, we were inspired by Grail Marcus's Lipstick Traces, which we read, when we were barely out of high school, and really excited us with this idea that you could discover these kind of secret histories and read them backwards and forwards, and use these kind of moments that maybe people hadn't paid much attention to in new and potentially resistant ways. So I now look on that book fondly and see its flaws too, but I think there's still something very inspiring in that as a model. What we ended up doing with Dada and constructivism in our book was to kind of say, okay, within Dada we see this very strong demand for freedom, for kind of individual liberation, from the kind of
the original moment of Dada, like Dada Zurich 1917, like the more overtly political collectivized forms of Dada, like in Berlin later on, etc.
And then, to very schematically contrast that with the kind of project of equality in Russia through constructivism. But then, from that very schematic kind of diagramming of those two movements, we zoom in on specific moments that are kind of pregnant with other potentials, and where it doesn't collapse into Stalinism, where the kind of emancipatory project doesn't become the kind of very predictable critique of the artist railing against society, but something more complex happens in Dada. Like, for example, in the story of the Dada procession, Every Man His Own Football, which is kind of a mock protest that ends up really confusing the authorities precisely because it doesn't have a very clear target, because this group of people comes together and does something weird on the street, but there's no banner telling you what it is. It's not clear. And it ends up being critical of the kinds of processions that were happening around them. It's both critical of the kind of organized left and of the state apparatus that represses that. And we thought there was something interesting in that moment of confusion that maybe is worth looking back to. Or the Kino Train, the kind of constructivist project of bringing the means of making films to the people as something that people just do together and doesn't necessarily result in like some exhibition form or something like this. So maybe those are kind of things we can tap into and say, okay, that's an interesting thing we could take from that and synthesize some new kind of version of those ideas.
There's one point where you say something like you're talking about a non-situationist dialectic, which creates a position which is both outside the museum, outside of everyday life, but is sort of another space, and how you
Oh, I think you're frozen. Sorry.
operate from that other space. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, you just got frozen there for
Just for a
10
second.
seconds,
But yeah, I mean, we were kind of quoting De Boer in that section, thinking about the possibility of operating outside the museum. But De Boer kind of dismisses that idea. Like for him, it's a bad thing to try to stand outside of these things, outside of the existing art structures and outside of everyday life. That would be like making a kind of anti-art, and that immediately gets recuperated back into the institution. So like the way that you make kind of a Banksy street art moment, and then that gets folded back into the museum very quickly. I think what he was trying to contrast that with is not making art outside the museum that still, is art in a kind of separate way to existence, but rather kind of maybe recycling the cultural output of what he called the spectacle, which we're inundated with anyway. So you don't try and make anything that is outside of that, and you don't try to evade capture. You presume capture. You presume that we're starting from this situation where everything is co-optable. But then what happens if we remix things? Can we use that use the kind of culture that is fed to us to say something different? And that helped us inch towards this idea of over-identification, where we acknowledge the seductiveness of the spectacle, like why people go along with this system that we live in. I don't think it's enough to say that everyone is a fool, this kind of theory of false consciousness. I don't think we're all tricked into agreeing to capitalism. I think there is something at the heart of it, which is, there is a carrot. I keep saying we're now living in the stick period where the carrot has become very small, but I still think
baby carrots that you sometimes have next to a hummus bowl.
But there is a kind of promise within all these things that we're talking about, like, why do you care about your job beyond the way you might care about washing dishes? When I go home after teaching, I genuinely care about my students and I think about them, and I'm kind of preoccupied with stuff that happened at work. When I make an artwork, if I'm collaborating with people, anyone who's done anything creative will know that you become very involved in that and you think about it all the time. So those things are kind of real. And I don't think it helps to try and stand outside of that and be cynical about it, which is, I think, what De Boer is trying to say in that section.
Yeah, I mean, so kind of like to summarize, I guess we're going through different models, and the kind of like the data model is more about kind of liberating yourself from the conditions of kind of work or production in general. Maybe it's a kind of like exaggeration of the bohemian late romantic model of the artist as a kind of floating eye above society, just a pure signifier of freedom. That is clearly impossible for us. We also think that as much as like the model, the constructivist or productivist model is attractive and interesting, it's also impossible because it relies on state support and subsidies that are certainly not available. So, you know, the kind of Kino train operation is funded by the Soviet state. And, you know, they give them a train to take to the workers to make films. So what we're left with is simply a way of finding a way of finding a way to become, to still practice, to still come up with interesting ideas and to kind of like digest the kind of culture that we swim in a kind of like interesting and resistant way, which is, I guess, like closer to the situationist project.
No, but I think that's why it makes sense and why you go to using some ideas or over-identification. If you can't find an outside to retreat from, to critique from, you over-identification becomes a different way to engage with what you're already inside of, and how you find ways to push through that rather than trying to think you can just magically escape it.
I mean, we were very hesitant, especially publishing the book now, rather than when we wrote most of that material, to use that word over-identification, because we recognize that a lot of the applications of that term are not the kinds of things that we would want to promote. We try and make that distinction in the book as well. I think it's become almost a kind of slightly edgelord term for people who want to pretend to be a Nazi or something, which we're just not interested in and never have been really. I don't think a kind of ironic performance of authority is what we mean when we use that term. And I don't think that's ultimately what is there in Zizek's formulation of it, or in the work of NSK or Leibach, where he develops that term from. I think that's a very superficial reading of anything that those people were doing as well. But for me, what was key in it is this term identification. Like, in what sense are you over-identifying with a system? I don't think that's just, you know, pretending to be the CEO of a company to say that companies are bad or something like this. But I think it's genuinely trying to find what is the promise within the system that the system doesn't deliver. You know, how do we make the demand for that to be real? So if we're told that, you know, our singular subjectivity can be realized by some bio-tracking app, maybe having our singular subjectivity recognized is not a bad thing in and of itself. It's just that the app isn't delivering it.
I was just going to ask one more thing and then nudge towards a certain conclusion anyways.
Yeah, sure. Pil's coming back. So.
Yeah, I'm coming.
Okay.
All good.
I was just going to ask one more thing and then sort of like nudge towards concluding. So I'll pause for a second so that I can make it editing easier.
Yeah, apologies for that. I'm sure you'll figure it out.
Well, so maybe just think of one more thing then. I think we're saying about over-identification as being sort of a, you know, Nazi Hezbollah's thing. Not, it's basically people who don't actually understand, don't get it. It's providing kind of a cover, right? And I think it's what's interesting about the way you engage with over-identification. It's almost like you emphasize that you have to be actually identifying with something. So if you're pressing a system to over the, let's say, the utopian promise or potential that it can't deliver, you're at every over-identification that isn't just being a shitty crypto Nazi, is actually based upon a deeper form of identification. And and trying to work towards that. And overidentification becomes more a kind of like a tactical negotiation of trying to sabotage a certain setup rather than, yeah. But I think it's a really interesting way to think about it in a way which doesn't fall into that sort of like edgelord kind of way. And maybe as a way to sort of nudge towards a sort of, a conclusion, since I think we're about past the hour now, is maybe sort of like maybe thinking about like where you go from here, like um um and in certain ways, what can be nudged, in what direction. It seems to be at this point trying to, for instance, nudge the Starmer government in any direction seems
Mm.
vaguely hopeless at best, and even worse at possibly. Yeah, where now from here?
I totally agree. I mean, yeah, it's hard not to fall into complete despair. I regularly listen to this podcast, Know Your Enemy, which is about the American right, which I really enjoy. And in one episode, they talk about the obligation on the left to cultivate hope and how that's hard work. And I think that's kind of true. That's our job. I think the point about starting from identification comes also from our very sort of specific biographical circumstances, coming from Israel, from a state that was ostensibly socialist and changed in our lifetime to capitalist, whatever those things kind of mean. I think we initially experienced the opening up of the market as a very positive development, and we were very excited by things like Americanization. So I think we genuinely did identify with capitalism, consumerism. Those things seemed genuinely emancipatory.
I mean, when you're 12 and there's one brand of like shoes or chocolate, and then someone introduces American goods, like, whoa, the
Yeah,
future arrived.
it was amazing. So that's why I kind of don't buy kind of I feel it's patronizing when people say, you're just deluded to somebody who's drawn to that. I think there's something real in that. Like two kinds of chocolate are better in some ways. But also, having moved to the UK, you develop a kind of relativism. So I feel like now I understand the shortcomings of what was sold to us as this kind of capitalist dream. But I think you need to hold on to the kind of good things that are real within that. And the kind of promise of self-realization, is a good one. And the promise of a place where you can be creative, and enjoy art and music and all those things. Those things are still real, and we need to find a way to achieve them. And I think for me, the analysis leads to, okay, they shouldn't just be for the special people, they should be for everyone. What's stopping us from doing that? And I think it's the fact that people still ultimately believe in the myth of meritocracy. And I think this is maybe the kind of point that needs to be pushed at within, the current government, let's say, because that is the kind of rhetoric that justifies the situation, is that the people who do well deserve to do well, the people who don't do well deserve not to do well. Whether that's talking about why we should stop illegal migrants, what makes them illegal, why are they migrating? So we have to kind of ask, okay, so why is it that the place where you're born should dictate, your future? So, to me, the abolition of borders follows on from that very logical kind of thought. Or, for example, why should you inherit money just because your parents were better off than other people's parents? So we should abolish inheritance. So in terms of what demands we should be making, those are the demands. And, people kind of laugh at me when I say these things, but that's what I think, as a minimum, on a horizontal level, border abolition, on a vertical level of time, inheritance abolition. We could then go into other things. But those things are as realistic or unrealistic as any other demands. I don't know why we shouldn't be making those demands on any government, but they start from analyzing people's beliefs and aspirations. And I think when you put it that way, maybe that is what can, achieve change. So there are very practical kind of things that, like, we should all have access to really cool libraries, but then there are also these kinds of bigger, there's
And
long-term projects and
maybe in a broader sense, like I think a lot of people feel that there's a lack of kind of organizing today. That, I mean, certainly the old institutions through which politics was organized has been organized, including unions, and kind of parties have been tremendously weakened. We just don't have like them anymore in the same way. But I think for us, we're losing more badly even the ideological battle. As in, I think people are not, there's not enough kind of clear analysis of those effective ideological economic positions, like how we live our lives, why we believe in the things that we believe in, and in what kind of like, what demands does that place on us as workers or as kind of like people. It's not just, it's kind of like ideology in the sense that it's kind of completely naturalized and becomes like obvious common sense in the Gramscian sense, but also that it kind of like it's almost like an aesthetic filter that we need. This is why art is quite useful. Sort of like I think late capitalism has managed to turn itself somehow into an aesthetic prism that presents this production of the self, even the kind of traumatic dark sides of the self, but still this kind of production of you as something that you promote, sell, advertise, market to the world as attractive and kind of worthy. And there's not enough kind of like thinking about that. So this is why we keep going back to those kind of questions. Our next book that will come out in 25 is very different. It's about music, but it keeps going back to those questions about the relationship between material conditions and kind of subjective positions and the promises of maybe failed moments in kind of like the history of kind of like music, I guess.
Cool. Well, with that, I will say thank you very much to you both for coming along. And yeah, I look forward to reading that when you get to it.
Well,
thank you so much.
yeah, we'll let you know when it happens. Thanks so much, Stephen. It was a pleasure talking to you.